Any questions about the western part of the empire and politics that are tied up with all of this? Let's shift then to the east, what's often referred to as the Byzantine Empire. Technically, though, it's the Roman Empire. But the term, as Ferguson notes, helps us distinguish it from the West. The empire split had been solidified in 395, even though Theodosius had died a few years previously. And so the imperial line continued in the West, even as it had died off, continued in the East, even though it had died off in the West. There are a variety of emperors during this time, and we could talk about all of them, but they don't all necessarily relate to impacts politically with Christianity. Certainly the majority of them would claim Christian heritage from the time of Constantine on, but not all of them made any sort of significant impact on Christianity with respect to politics. One of them, though, that was important for all of this was the Emperor Justinian. Justinian had grown up as a native Latin speaker, one of the few in recent years to take to the empire. He'd come from a peasant family, but his uncle had become emperor and had adopted him and eventually made Justinian his co-ruler, associate emperor, in 527. Justinian was educated in Constantinople, then regarding law, theology, and history. Contemporary sources describe Justinian as short, fair-skinned, and curly hair. Eventually, after his uncle's death, he becomes the sole Roman emperor, I guess we could say, the sole Byzantine emperor, and becomes important for a couple of things specifically related to his revision of Roman law. Prior to this point, there had been no attempt in any other centuries to try and take a look at Roman law and find a way to revise it, bring it up to date, address some other things. And so Justinian kind of becomes responsible for it. It's not that, of course, he took the time to do it all, but make sure that it is done. It becomes known as the body of civil law, sometimes referred to as the Code of Justinian. Justinian is often considered, looking back in history, as one of the great lawgivers. And this is partially evidenced in the fact that he is pictured on the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., alongside individuals like Moses, Hammurabi, and even Muhammad. Justinian was not only successful when it came to his legal theory, was also successful with respect to military might and power as well. And on Thursday, we'll also talk about his contributions to theology, because they are also important. We've already mentioned some of this, of course, as Justinian's armies who root the Vandals out of North Africa. He's the one whose armies take over Italy from the Goths, and had even made inroads into Spain, essentially trying to reunify what had been the Roman Empire. However, the Byzantine Empire still faced some challenges, not just under Justinian's time, but others as well. There continued to be people who held on to paganism. Eventually, though, Justinian legislated against paganism and also became concerned about heretical forms of Christianity as well, deciding that these were some things where the law needed to intervene. The emperor needed to intervene. And so a variety of laws were passed related to these things, essentially kind of bringing the emperor into concerns that the church might have felt that were their control. So there were a variety of laws passed about the baptism of children, especially pagan children. Anyone who refused to be baptized would have their property seized by the government. And there was also legislation against Judaism. But essentially, here we're seeing a blurring in the eastern part of the empire, and we'll talk more again about this on Thursday, between church and state. Where does the one stop and the other begin? How are these two spheres, so to speak, supposed to interact? So the emperors continued to find themselves caught up in church business as they had since the time of Constantine. Sometimes this was due to them being asked to intervene. If there's a particular conflict going on, one side of that conflict might appeal to the emperor to become involved in the situation to try and work on their side. Sometimes they did so through their own initiative, feeling that it was their right or their duty as emperor to do so. Others, however, also had some skill in theology. Justinian, for example, wrote theological treatises about the issues of his day, not just leaving that to bishops or others. And of course, often the emperors were caught up in this issue of dealing with heretics, particularly persecuting them. Also during Justinian's rule, there were the establishment of the 5 great patriarchs. The model that's developing in the eastern part of the empire that remains today was that of the patriarch, who often worked similarly to the bishop in the West. But there were still bishops in the Eastern Church as well. Essentially, the patriarch was more over a region, right? Often centered in a city, but was over a region, or people looked to specific patriarchs as having authority. The 5 great patriarchs during the time of the patriarchates, during the time of Justinian, and from there for quite a while, were the cities of Rome. Second after that, Constantinople, the city of Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and in Jerusalem. And so these two were looked upon as being apostolic in origin. They were looked upon as being orthodox in theology. And so there was kind of an additional level of authority these patriarchs had over other individuals, other bishops. Any questions about the Byzantine Empire? We're much more briefly looking at that than what we did in the West. While a lot of that is going on, these emperors rising and falling, tribes moving throughout Europe, splits between East and West, out in the Arabian Peninsula, something different was taking place. In the 6th century CE, AD, the region of Arabia was largely focused on, or was largely organized according to tribes. There wasn't a distinct unity between the tribes like what we think of with like the Roman Empire. And so you as an individual lived in an extended family. Several families were a part of a clan. Several clans were a part of a tribe. And of course, as you know, probably expect, the tribal identity shaped a lot of your identity. So who you were allies with, who you were enemies with, who you could get married to, were shaped by this tribal identity. Many of the tribes in Arabia tended to be polytheistic, but there weren't just polytheists in Arabia. There were monotheists as well. There were Christians, there were Jews, and then others known as Hanifs, or pious ones, who also believed in an ethical monotheism. That idea that there's one God and he expects people to live in certain ways. Arabia, unlike how it's been presented sometimes in Western history, was not someplace out of, kind of the backwaters of the world. It was a place that was very much involved and very much connected to a lot of the other things that were going on around it. Mecca and other important cities in Arabia had a lot of merchant activities, so the Arabs came into contact with people from all over the non-Arabian world. Especially as we're talking about the 6th century, when there's a lot of conflict between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire in Persia. And so as these two groups are fighting, the Silk Route to China is pushed down through Arabia. And so merchants were coming through there all of the time. Individual identity and rights were subordinated to tribal and family identity. Authority and law were very important as well. Justice was guaranteed by the threat of retaliation. And the key virtue at this time was that of manliness, which is not just about being a man, but it was also about loyalty to family, the protection of its members, bravery in battle, extending hospitality, living according to honor. And it was in all of this that in the year 570, Muhammad, son of Abdullah, was born. Muhammad seems to have been kind of marginalized in Meccan society growing up. His parents had died fairly early in his life. His father actually died before he was born, his mother shortly after. And while he did have a powerful uncle and lived with his grandfather, without having a father, essentially being an orphan, he was not looked upon favorably by the Meccan society. And so ended up being a shepherd for a while when young, but eventually had worked his way into business. And it was as a business person that he meets a woman who will eventually become his wife, a woman named Khadijah, who's a very successful businesswoman in Mecca, and is there where Muhammad begins to become successful. But when he is about 40 years old, Muhammad starts to claim that he has been having revelations from God. In the month Ramadan, month in the Arabic calendar, Muhammad supposedly had been out in the desert wilderness, kind of on a religious retreat, when the angel Gabriel had appeared to him and told him he was going to be a prophet of God. Now, the message that Muhammad starts preaching is that of submission to the one God. And so very strict monotheism. And this idea of submission is the English translation of the Arabic word Islam. And so he's preaching this submission to God, the monotheistic God. And those that are submitting to this are known as Muslims. Now, as he starts preaching this, he has very little success. A few people in his family are accepting what he has to say. Others, however, don't. And it's, obviously Christians and Jews wouldn't have recognized him as a prophet of God, but the problem for most of the people in Mecca is that they are polytheistic. And so the idea that there's just one God was, hard to believe at the beginning. And additionally, it also becomes an issue of Mecca was an important religious pilgrimage site, especially a cubical structure known as the Kaaba, black cube out in the middle of out in the city of Mecca. And so people would come to Mecca on a religious pilgrimage to go to the Kaaba and see images, pay money to the tribe that controlled the Kaaba to visit the images of their deities. And so the ruling power, the ruling tribe in Mecca, of which Muhammad is technically a part, looks at Muhammad as not just problematic religiously, but also threatening their power and their finances. But he has some protection due to his uncle being powerful, his wife being powerful as well. Both of them, however, died in the year 619.